The Spotless Kingdom, what the Clean Countries Council, The Pioneer, written by Acharya Prashant, July 4th, 2026. I have been traveling through Britain these past weeks, speaking at Cambridge, at Oxford, and in the British Parliament on freedom, self knowledge, and the climate crisis. Last Friday evening, at the London School of Economics, I sat in a long public dialogue with Professor Jonathan Birch on the question of animal sentience. How does one know whether very small creatures feel anything at all? It is a serious question, and Britain has taken it seriously. Professor Birch's research informed recent animal welfare legislation passed by the British Parliament, and in matters of animal protection, Britain is counted among the leading nations of the world. That same evening, I went to Richmond Park, the great royal park on the edge of London. Dusk was settling. Deer grazed on the open grass without a trace of fear. Rabbits darted out of the undergrowth. Rabbits darted out of the undergrowth. At first sight, the park seems to announce something admirable about the society that maintains it. Look, it says, how free these animals are, how protected. Then I learned that every year roughly 200 deer are killed in this very park, methodically as a matter of policy. The history explains the arithmetic. Richmond Park was enclosed in 1637 by Charles I as a hunting ground, and the deer were brought in for exactly that purpose. They are not native to this ground. They were imported for royal sport. The centuries passed, the hunting stopped, but the deer remained inside the same walls. Now when their numbers grow, the growth is described as a problem, and the killing is described as management. Consider the sequence. First, uproot an animal from its habitat and settle it elsewhere for your entertainment. Next, declare the settlement you created to be an ecological problem and offer the killing of the settled as its solution. The killing itself is conducted at night in silence, so that no visitor strolling through the park the next morning has the faintest idea of what happened there in the dark. The park photographs beautifully, and that is precisely what should give one pause. A scene can look clean for two very different reasons: because the dirt has been removed, or because the dirt has been hidden. The whole of this article is about learning to tell those two parts, because the difference between them is the difference the developed world has spent decades refusing to examine. The question feels sharper this summer than ever, with Europe scorching under record heat and the climate crisis sitting at the center of every serious international conversation. What the park and its deer communicate is not love of animals, but the performance of it. What the park and its deer communicate is not love of animals, but the performance of it. Real affection for these creatures would never have tolerated the arrangement in the first place. Brought here for slaughter, kept here for display, killed here for convenience, generation after generation. The welfare legislation is real, the research behind is rigorous, and the killing continues regardless. and the killing continues regardless. The two facts sit side by side without embarrassment, and that ability of a society to hold both without discomfort is the subject that deserves attention. The world that convicts its speaker. The developed world speaks a particular vocabulary: clean energy, clean technology, clean growth. Listen to this vocabulary carefully because it contains a confession its speakers did not intend to make. The moment a technology is called clean because it emits less carbon, a definition has been established. Cleanliness now means low carbon. Low carbon. Cleanliness now means low carbon. Dirt now means high carbon. That definition did not come from the global south. It was authored and institutionalized by the developed nations themselves. Very well, then, let the definition be applied consistently. If it holds for a nation, it must also hold for the society that runs the nation. A nation cannot christen its turbines clean by the carbon standard and then exempt its own way of life from the same standard. It's worth noticing that nothing in this argument requires a new yardstick. The global south has not been asked to invent a rival definition of cleanliness, and none is being proposed here. The vocabulary of the wealthy world is simply being taken at its word and followed to where it leads, and where it leads is uncomfortable for its authors. The technology may well be clean by the very measure that certifies the technology. The country operating it has remained dirty. A metric does not stop at the factory gate out of politeness. Much the same holds for the world developed itself. The levels of the modern world were not distributed by a neutral referee. The nations that call themselves developed are the nations that did the calling, and the nations they call unclean were never consulted about the criteria. That is what makes the carbon vocabulary so useful. For once, the criterion is numerical and public, authored entirely by the accusers, and for once it convicts them. Apply it, and the world's moral geography rearranges itself. The global average for per capita carbon emissions stands at roughly 4.9 tons. 4.9 tons a year. Saudi Arabia sits near 22.8 tons. Australia at 22.3. Canada at 19.8, Russia at 18, the United States at 17.3. These five occupy a band between 3.5 and nearly 5 times the world average. And most of them build their prosperity directly on the oil and gas whose burning manufactured this crisis. This means the wealth and the dirt are in these cases the same substance recorded under different names. India's figure is about 2 tons per person, among the lowest of any major economy on earth. And that figure belongs to a country carrying a fifth of humanity. By the developed world's own chosen metric, the country so long dismissed as unclean stands in the front rank of the world's clean nations, and the nations that do the dismissing stand at the back. One more fact belongs in this ledger. A significant share of India's emissions is generated in producing goods that are consumed elsewhere. The garments, the chemicals, the steel, the refined fuels that leave Indian ports for foreign markets. The smoke rises over Indian cities, the products land on tables in richer ones. India is carrying not only its own carbon but a portion of other nations' carbon as well. And the accounting systems of the world record this burden as India's dirt. Carbon dioxide is colorless, and its colorlessness has been the greatest public relations gift the wealthy nations ever received. Had the gas carried even a faint tint, the sky above the world's richest cities would have settled the debate generations ago, and the global list of dirty countries would read very differently than it does in the popular imagination. Reduction or relocation. Britain's own carbon record sharpens the argument further, and it deserves to be read closely rather than applauded quickly. Measured within its own borders, Britain's emissions have fallen by about 54% since 1990. Stated that way, it sounds like one of the great environmental achievements of the age, and it is presented as exactly that. But national borders are an accounting convention, and the atmosphere keeps no national accounts. Measure the same country by consumption, counting the carbon embedded in every imported car, garment, phone, and beam of steel, and the fall shrinks to roughly 20%. The gap between those two numbers is the story, and what the gap records is relocation rather than reduction. The heavy industry left, taking its smoke with it to Asia and elsewhere. The demand that sustains the industry never left at all. Britain's purchases Britain's purchases did not change when its chimneys closed. The chimneys simply reopened elsewhere, in places whose skies never appear in British statistics. On paper, the books of the nation improved dramatically. In the air, where the only leisure that matters is kept, the improvement was a fraction of the claim. The furnace was moved out of the house while the appetite that feeds the furnace stayed home. And the house now congratulates itself on its air quality. The relocation extends well past industry. The developed world's discarded clothing, rejected and unwanted, flows in enormous quantities toward the global south. A great deal of it ends up in Indian cities such as Panipat, where the waste is sorted, shredded, and endured by people who never wore the garments, while the sender's own house stays immaculate. He has donated nothing, reduced nothing, changed nothing. He has simply deposited his dirt at someone else's address, and in many cases extracted a price for the privilege of doing so. None of this prosperity fell from the sky. Behind it lie centuries of colonialism. Behind it lies centuries of colonialism, the extraction of other people's resources, and a pattern of trade between the global north and the global south, whose scales have never once balanced. A simple metaphor carries the whole argument. Suppose a grandmother left the family a great house worth a fortune, and the house is named Earth. If the heir now dismantles that house piece by piece, sells the bricks and the beams, pockets the proceeds, and announces after every sale how much he has earned, no sane accountant would call this income. It is the liquidation of an inheritance, and in plainer language, it is theft from one's own home. What the developed nations enter into their ledgers as profit has very often been the quiet cell of the capital called nature. Fairness requires acknowledging what deserves acknowledgement, and I do so without reluctance. Europe's efforts at reduction have not been empty. Britain, France, the Netherlands, and others have made real attempts, incomplete in execution but not hollow in intent. And the discipline with which these societies plan and implement remains something the rest of the world can learn from. Credit, however, is one thing, blindness is another. Extending the first need not require the second. Within this picture, however, one nation stands conspicuously outside every frame of accountability, and that nation is the United States. Since the Industrial Revolution, the United States has poured roughly 430 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, close to a quarter of all historical emissions from fossil fuels and industry, far ahead of China in second place. Its per capita emissions today remain around 3.5 times the global average. Yet observe its conduct in the climate negotiations. When the Paris Agreement demanded commitment, it walked away. And when binding targets for carbon reduction were proposed, it exempted itself. The country that burned the most answers for the least. And the international order has arranged itself around this inversion so thoroughly that the inversion no longer even registers as scandal. Other neither nation nor race. A clarification is necessary here because the argument invites a misreading. Nothing said so far is an indictment of any particular people because the tendency being described is universal, and India supplies its own evidence. Watch an Indian abroad. The same person who tosses litter onto his own street without a second thought becomes in London or Singapore a scrupulous follower of every rule. He queries, he queues, sorts his rubbish, waits for the signal. His nationality has not changed between the two cities. His circumstances have. And when conduct changes with circumstances, the conclusion writes itself. The change came from outside pressure rather than inner intent, from fear of fines, from surveillance, from the social shame of being seen. Remove the pressure and the old habit walks straight back in. The cleanliness of the wealthy world is to a large degree the child of prosperity and enforcement rather than of any inward turning. Inside India, the same test applies. In the prosperous enclaves of Indian cities, standard of public cleanliness match anything in the West, which confirms that the variable is affluence, not culture or race. And at the other end, where a family's next meal and physical safety are what hang in the balance, demanding attention to public hygiene is a form of cruelty dressed as civic virtue. A person fighting for bread cannot be lectured about litter by a person who has never missed one. So the matter was never one of nation or race, it is one of circumstance, and beneath circumstance of the ego, which bows readily to external pressure while remaining untouched within. The fine, the camera, and the disapproving glance can all discipline behavior. None of them has ever reached the one behaving. That is why the discipline travels so poorly, evaporating the moment the enforcement does. So the real question was never whether the cleanliness exists. Anyone can see that it exists. The lawns of London are proof enough. The question is what the cleanliness proceeds from. The cleanliness born from of fear departs when the fear departs, and the kind born of law breaks wherever the law cannot see. And for the cleanliness maintained for display, it does not remove dirt at all. It relocates dirt to wherever the audience isn't looking, which is exactly what the emissions data, the waste flows, and the nighttime calls of Richmond Park all describe in their different vocabularies. Had there been real love of cleanliness, the response to dirt would have been its removal rather than its concealment. The industry's demand would have been reduced rather than its address changed. The deer would never have needed the darkness. Every one of these arrangements testifies to the same thing, which is that the claim of love remains, so far, a performance of love. So what then does real cleanliness actually mean? The ego is the performer. The ego is the dirt within, and the same ego is what dirties the world without. A polluted interior can polish its exterior endlessly and produce nothing except dirt with a better complexion. Whether a cleanliness of another kind is possible, one that does not lean on enforcement or on being watched cannot be settled by or on being watched. Whether a cleanliness of another kind is possible, one that does not lean on enforcement or on being watched cannot be settled by argument, because it would require the cleaner to first look at himself, and that examination cannot be legislated, purchased, or outsourced to anyone. That evening to Richmond Park stays with me. The deer will be grazing just as calmly tonight, and the city around them will be gleaming just as flawlessly. Somewhere in the coming months, on some scheduled night, about 200 of them will quietly cease to exist, and the morning visitors will notice nothing. If carbon dioxide ever acquires a color, the world will discover where its real dirt has been accumulating all along. Until then, the question stands open, unanswered by any summit or statue who will render the true account of the developed world's cleanliness. Acharya Prashant is a philosopher and author whose work centers on self-inquiry and its application to contemporary life. Views presented are personal. Acharya Prashant is a philosopher and author whose work centers on self-inquiry and its application to contemporary life. Views presented are personal.